In our last lecture, I told you about the conquest of Jerusalem, the massacre that followed, and then the Crusaders waking up on Sunday and thanking God in the Holy Sepulchre Church for the great support, for the help he gave them in fulfilling their destiny and freeing Jerusalem from the Muslims. But that was just the beginning of the story of the Crusader kingdom, because now they had to decide how to proceed. It was just Jerusalem, and then also they had Bethlehem, they had Ramlah, and they had Jaffa. But the Holy Land is way bigger than that. So the question is, how do we proceed? The first thing they decided to do is to elect a king. So they turned to one of the leaders, one of the most important leaders of the army, Godfrey de Bouillon, or Godefroy, as the French would call him. And Godfrey de Bouillon was a pious Christian and also a great warrior, so he seemed to be the most obvious choice. And he said, yes, I'm willing to be your leader, but I'm not willing to be titled the King of Jerusalem. Why? Because in a place where Jesus walked with the crown of thorns, I will not dare carry a crown of gold. Don't call me a king. All right, they said, so how would you like us to call you? And he said, call me the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, or the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. And that indeed was his title. So Godfrey de Bouillon was actually a king, by all means, but he was never named, or was never titled the King of Jerusalem. He would be the first king of the first leader or king of the Crusaders, and he will be replaced later, actually a year later, he didn't live long, by his brother Baldwin I. But before we get there, let's focus for a second on the political agenda of the Crusaders. How do we proceed once we have a king, we have an army? How do we proceed to take over the entire Holy Land? The first thing they did is take over the mountain ridge. The occupation of the mountain ridge was the easiest task. For those of you who are not familiar with the shape of the Holy Land, it's quite simple actually. On one hand, we have the coastal plain and the Mediterranean Sea. On the other hand, another low region, which is called the Beit She'an Valley or the Jordan Valley. It has several names. And in the middle, we have the mountain ridge. Throughout the history of the Holy Land, the most occupied areas were the lower regions. And so the strongest Muslim cities are not on the mountain ridge. On the mountain ridge, there are mostly villages and small cities. So the easiest task would be to get over that. And indeed, within a couple of months, the mountain ridge was under Crusader control. And then they had to decide where the borders should lie. Obviously, the western part was the easy part, as the western part is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. And obviously, the Crusaders would want to have the coastal plain cities, because the coastal plain cities are extremely important for their survival. Firstly, if the Crusaders don't hold the coastal plain cities, the Muslims will invade through this direction. So they had to keep it themselves. Secondly, the coastal plain cities are the outlet. This is the way out of the Holy Land. The Muslims will not allow another crusade to come via land, but from the sea, you could bring supplies, support warriors, and whatever you need. Of course, the Crusaders needed trade with the West. So the coastal plain cities, the harbors, are extremely important. We already have Jaffa, but Haifa, also Akko, Ashkelon, Gaza, all these cities are now to be taken by the Crusaders. That would be the obvious western border of the Crusader kingdom. In the east, the Crusaders went beyond the Jordan River to what's nowadays the Kingdom of Jordan. There, there's the highway, the road on the mountain ridge, basically leading from Damascus to the Arabian Peninsula. And the Crusaders wanted to have control over that road too, for two reasons. Firstly, once they have that road, they control all of the international roads that go through the land of Israel from south to north. And secondly, if they control the main international roads, they now divide the Muslims from the north to the north of the kingdom, from the Muslims in Egypt to the south of the kingdom. So by controlling the main routes, the international routes that cross the Holy Land from south to north, the Crusaders basically create a kind of a barrier which makes it very difficult for the Muslims in the south and in the north to join forces in the future and attack the Crusader kingdom. So obviously the eastern border is quite understandable. In the south, it was the Egyptian kingdom of the Muslims, the Fatimids. In the north, no problem. Other Crusader kingdoms were established, such as the kingdom of Tripoli, so the Crusaders didn't have to bother much with what happens in the north. Once the Crusaders gained control over the country, and it took them a couple of decades. When I speak about that, it sounds quite easy to conquer everything, but in reality, things took a while, actually a couple of decades. For instance, the southern coastal plain city of Ashkelon survived against the constant Crusader attacks until the year 1153. For 2 generations, the Crusaders couldn't get rid of Ashkelon, couldn't gain control over Ashkelon. So yes, it took them a while, but most of the country was theirs within the first decade. So now the question was, how do we keep what we've just gained? Remember, the Crusaders number perhaps a couple of tens of thousands of people. When they came out of Europe, maybe there were 150,000 of them. Now in the Holy Land, we're talking about a couple of tens of thousands, not more than that. We don't have the exact numbers, but it's the size of the army and the population here, a couple of thousands. They cannot simply hold the borders against millions of Muslims surrounding them. So the method they developed to control the country and defend their borders was ingenious. Instead of having a Crusader soldier every 10 meters along the borders, which of course was impossible, they simply built fortresses. A fortress is a castle. Now, when you think about castles in England or in France, you think about huge castles. Yes, some of them were quite big. Some of them were very small for 10, 15 nights. And basically, it's like local police stations. You have a group of soldiers here, a group of soldiers there. If there's an invasion, a small-scale invasion, problem with Bedouins invading, they can manage that. But if there's a large army approaching, as indeed it will happen in the future, what they do is very simple. They send word to Jerusalem, announce what happens, and then all of them gather together, they join together at an agreed spot and begin campaign against the Muslims. So the method of using fortresses allowed the Crusaders to have small numbers of soldiers in specific key spots in the country and enable them to do other things other than simply guard the borders every day and every night. Some of the fortresses, as I said, were quite big. Tzfat, for instance, the fortress of Tzfat, was actually the biggest in the world at the time. There's no bigger Crusader fortress in Cyprus, in Lebanon, in Jordan, or anywhere else. So that is quite impressive. Let's say a word or two about the main Crusader kings. I'm not going to elaborate on each one of them, but some of them are quite important. We've mentioned also already Godfrey de Bouillon, and he ruled from 1099 to 1100, so just one year, is, as we said earlier, the protector of the Holy Sepulchre Church, and he died immediately after his ascent to the throne and replaced by his brother Baldwin I. Mind you, there were many things Baldwin I knew, but I can tell you, I guarantee, he didn't know he was Baldwin I. His name was Baldwin, but we gave him the number first because later there will be Baldwin II and the third and the fourth and the fifth. So Baldwin I is the name we gave him. Baldwin I, the brother of Godfrey de Bouillon, rules from 1100 until 1118, okay, for 19 years. And he is the one responsible for occupying most of the territories that the Crusaders actually had in the 12th century. His palace, by the way, was in Jerusalem, and it was located in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa Mosque is actually a Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Crusaders saw the magnificent Muslim mosques on the Temple Mount, and they nicknamed Al-Aqsa Templum Salomonis, the temple of King Solomon. So obviously they were wrong, they didn't know their history well enough, but the name stuck, and he, Baldwin I, made the Al-Aqsa Mosque his palace. Later, by the way, he's going to move to the area of present-day Jaffa Gate. Jaffa Gate is near the Citadel, the Tower of David Museum today, and there a palace was built for the next kings. So the residence of the king began on the Temple Mount, but he later moved to somewhere else. Then comes Baldwin II. I'm not going to give you the dates, just the general notions of some important things that are linked to him. He married a woman named Morphia. She was a princess coming from quite far. She came from Armenia. There was an independent Armenian Christian, Eastern Christian state in southern Turkey today, and they were the allies of the Western Christians of Jerusalem, of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. So how do you express the political ties between two regimes, between two states? By ties of marriage. So Baldwin II married Morphia. His daughter, by the way, was Melisende, and I'm going to mention her shortly. In the time of Baldwin II, it's the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, the Muslim threat grew bigger significantly, and the Muslims continually attacked the Crusader state. In the time of Melisende, his daughter and her husband, Fulk of Anjou, he is obviously not a local one, he's a nobleman from Europe. That's the 30s, 40s, and 50s, a long period of time. Fortresses were built. Remember, that was the method used by the Crusaders to defend their country. So the fortresses began to be built in the time of Melisende and Fulk. And also the rebuilding and renewal of the Holy Sepulchre Church took place in the time of Melisende. The Holy Sepulchre Church was dedicated by the Crusaders in 1149. After the time of Melisende, it's her son, Baldwin III, then Amalric, then Baldwin IV. Baldwin IV is important, we'll get to him later. Baldwin IV controlled the Crusader kingdom from 1174 to 1185, 11 years, and he was a leper. That's quite interesting because lepers were usually excluded from the Christian society, but in the Holy Land, as you will see later, in the Crusader kingdom, lepers were part of the society, part of the army, and here we have a king who himself is a leper, and he is important mostly because he had to face the most dangerous threat the Crusaders had to face in the 12th century, and this is the great leader of the Muslims at the time, Saladin, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, as he is named in Arabic. The son of Baldwin IV was Baldwin V, and I only mention him because he ruled for 1 year. He was a young boy, and he died as a boy, so he's insignificant for us. And finally, the last king in the 12th century, the last king of the First Crusader kingdom, is Guy de Lusignan. Guy de Lusignan will go down in history as the man who lost the kingdom to Saladin in the famous battle of Karnei Chitin in Hebrew, the horns of Chitin, not far from Tiberias today.